Good morning. It's very nice to see all of you. I'm a bit sad myself, I have to say, because I don't know what's going to fill the void for me on Friday mornings. And I could keep going. I've so enjoyed doing this lecture series, and I'm so grateful to all of you for so faithfully attending and pushing me in the Q&A sessions and being the most responsive and wonderful audience I've ever had. So I'm very grateful to all of you. Thank you. Today is our last lecture. You've slogged with me through 5 lectures thus far. Last week we talked about civilians at the court of Madrid, the other great artistic center of 17th century Spain. We looked at Velázquez, we looked at Zurbaran's brief stay at the court, we looked at Juan Martínez Montañés and various other figures that had mostly come from Seville to the center of Spain. And today, today we will be talking about Zurbaran and Murillo. But before I begin, at the end of lecture last week, someone asked me to comment on the current political situation in Catalonia. And while I am no expert on contemporary politics and in particular the Catalan situation, I did realize that in precisely the period we're talking about, the 1640s and 50s, we see a set of events that in some ways prefigure what's going on today, and to some scholars are in fact the moment that begins a transformation of Catalan identity politics. This is a portrait of Philip IV at Fraga. Fraga is a town on the border of Aragon and Catalonia, and it was a portrait that Diego Velázquez painted of the king at his military camp. I'll explain more in a bit, but to, I think, truly understand the situation of Catalonia in the 1640s and to understand how it begins to announce and prefigure what will become a very tense situation between Catalonia and the rest of Spain, it's necessary to walk you through all of the royal titles of the King of Spain. And I'll explain in a bit why, but bear with me. I'm going to read all of them. So here we have in a publication I chose at random. Many texts published in Spain during this period had this prefatory text that paid homage to the king. And here it announces, Don Felipe, or King Philip, by the grace of God, King of Castile, Leon, Aragon, the 2 Sicilies, Jerusalem, Portugal, Navarre, Granada, Toledo, Valencia, Galicia, the Mallorcas, Seville, Sardinia, Cordoba, Corsica, Murcia, Jaén, the Algarves, Algeciras, Gibraltar, Canary Islands, the eastern and western Indies, islands and firm land of the overseas. This was a standard formula for describing the Americas. Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Brabant, Milan, Count of Habsburg, Flanders, Tyrol, and Barcelona, Lord of Vizcaya and of Molina, etc. I love the etc. So why am I listing all of these titles for you? It reflects, I think, most clearly what John Eliot, the great historian of Baroque Spain, called the Horizontal Monarchy. This was to say, people who lived in the kingdom of Aragon, for instance, did not think that they lived in Spain necessarily. Of course, the geographic entity of Hispania or Iberia certainly existed in their imagination, but this was a situation in which you had multiple kingdoms, all of which had as their head the king Philip IV in this case. This was not necessarily what in other contexts we see as a vertical monarchy where everything is ruled by one king. This was not necessarily all Spain. This was a collection of independent principalities and kingdoms, all of which enjoyed to some extent a certain degree of autonomy. They enjoyed certain privileges. Catalonia in particular, which is included under the kingdom of Aragon, but we also see the city of Barcelona. Where is it? Here it is. So we have 2 Catalan entities included here. The Kingdom of Aragon had a set of important privileges. This was a kingdom that had its own courts. It had a parliament of sorts. It was, however, ruled by a Castilian viceroy, just in the same way that Peru or Mexico were ruled by Spanish viceroys. Catalonia as well had a royal governor sent from the central provinces, usually from an aristocratic family or an ecclesiastic who oversaw royal interests there. This situation worked fairly well for a long time, but it wasn't until Spain became embroiled in a lengthy war with neighboring France that Catalonia began to feel a set of unprecedented pressures. Being on the border with France, inevitably, Catalonia became the kingdom that was asked to supply the most troops, the most supplies, and the most finances to the crushing war with France. And this inevitably produced a set of revolts in this region, which, as I also mentioned, was a region that had its own language. So language, as we discussed very early on, is inevitably an important part of identity. And so we have here Philip IV, here represented as a military commander precisely in the military campaign against France, but based in Catalonia. Catalonia was on the forefront of this military conflict. And finally, the conflict with France was resolved eventually. This is a painting of the meeting of the two kings, Louis XIV and Philip IV, at the so-called Isle of Pheasants. And you can see behind them Maria Theresa of Spain, who would the following year become the bride of Louis XIV. And this is a funny little island still on the border of France and Spain, which, funny fact, is administered by Spain for 6 months out of the year and by France for 6 months. And this rulership of this uninhabited piece of land was established in 1659 at the conclusion of the war with France. So I mention all of this not as a direct explanation of the current Catalan situation, but I think as something that mirrors or reflects or perhaps is the beginning of the long history that the region is living today. So I hope you excuse this kind of retreat back into 17th century in order to explain it, but it's the best I can do. So, Zurbaran and Murillo. Why am I talking about Murillo? Well, there's a very simple, I think a very good reason, is that in a little over a month, our permanent collection is being rehung to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Murillo's birth. It's being announced on the Meadows Museum website. And so I thought that it felt like a good opportunity to give you a teaser of the exhibition and also a teaser of the next Luis Martin lecture series, which will be delivered by a good friend of mine, Rebecca Quinteresi. She's a Southern Methodist University graduate and currently a doctoral candidate at Johns Hopkins University, actually a student of Felipe Pereda, who was just here last week speaking to us. So this will be a 5-part lecture series titled Murillo, Artistic Intelligence and the Spanish Golden Age. It'll be very fun for me to get up at 9:55 on a Friday and roll in late, sit in the back, put my legs up, and actually enjoy listening to one of these for a change. And I hope to see you all there. Today's lecture is divided into 6 parts. The first, Murillo's earliest works. We'll look at the career of Murillo in general through the lens of one particular art theorist, in fact, maybe the first art historian of early modern Spain. Then I'll talk about Zurbaran and Murillo as the 2 masters of visionary painting. Then I'll look at the influences of Italian painting on Murillo. And finally, confront sweetness, a category that to some made Murillo the most desirable, most interesting painter of the 17th century, and to others made him totally unpalatable. And confront that also with his paintings of rogues. Finally, second to last, we'll look at Murillo, the intellectual, an individual who self-fashioned himself as a gentleman and a thinker, not necessarily as a craftsman. And finally, we'll briefly review the whole series of lectures that we've had thus far. So, we'll be looking at Murillo's career through the lens of this text, the Museo Pictórico y Escala Óptica, which was written by Antonio Palomino. We're lucky to have a spectacular painting by Palomino just upstairs. He is a painter who lives and works on the cusp of the 17th and 18th centuries and is better known as an art theorist and as an art historian. And so he, modeling himself on Giorgio Vasari, the great Renaissance art historian, writes a history of Spanish painting, including a number of artists' biographies. And this is what I'll be using as the structure of today's lecture in order to learn about Murillo. We'll be using, however, the English translation. It's published very soon after in the 1730s. And so here's what he says. Bartolomé Murillo, painter. He was born 1613. Already we know that's wrong, but Palomino is not infallible, so let's just put that out there. At Pilas, a town 5 leagues from Seville, he was a disciple of Juan de Castillo, and after he had learned enough to maintain himself by painting such ordinary things as were usually put to sale at markets and fairs, he made up, a custom which prevailed very much at that time, a cargo of pictures for the Indies. Interesting. So we don't typically think of Murillo as participating in the trade with the New World in the same way that we have very well documented for Zurbaran. But of course it makes sense that a young painter in the very competitive market of 17th century Seville would participate precisely in this same artistic practice. As we know from Professor Delenda's talk, as we've heard in my previous lectures, the New World was a hungry market. It was a market that could sustain enormous amounts of artworks being sent there. And it's actually documented that Murillo did send a number of paintings to the New World, none of which, however, have been identified. This may be also because of what I will show you in just a moment, how closely his style resembles the work of his own teachers rather than what we typically associate with Murillo's later style. This is a wonderful 19th century painting of precisely this moment. Murillo at the market, hawking his wares. A young boy here, visible through his slightly later hairstyle. John Philip had to make it clear who this was. And here we have someone admiring a small canvas of his, which it's hard to make out, but if you look at the original painting, which is in Mexico City, you can see it's signed Murillo in the back. And this is a kind of artist's imagination of what this great painter's beginnings were. And this is one of these very, very earliest paintings by Murillo, painted around the time when he was around 20 years old. In some ways, looks nothing like the later paintings that we will come to recognize as Murillesque. It has nothing of that later style. In some ways, I think is much closer to a painting we actually have here at the Meadows Museum, which is this wonderful two-sided copper painting on copper by Alonso López de Herrera, representing the saints Thomas Aquinas and on the reverse St. Francis. And you can see significant similarities in style. Sorry for the graininess here, but it was hard to get a very high-resolution image of this early painting. But I'll show you here the St. Francis. I think you can see very clearly the similarities and how closely Murillo is painting in the style of this kind of more static, slightly less Caravagesque. There isn't the kind of expressiveness that we associate with Murillo's early paintings. And even this kind of precariously perched table, which seems to be about to fall off of the surface of the painting. Though I wonder, having lectured to you recently about these optical corrections that we know Zurbaran was making, perhaps if we were to see this painting from below in its original setting, maybe this table would make more sense optically. And this is a painting, I'm comparing these two paintings here, by Juan del Castillo and his workshop. In fact, workshop at this point may have included the young Murillo himself. So I'm showing you here a painting by Murillo's master, the person where Murillo had been apprenticed and one of Murillo's early independent works. And again, you can see the similarities in terms of formal qualities between these two works. A similar composition, although here we have this wonderful inclusion of the two donor portraits, highly naturalistic. And however, the kind of inclusion, the descending clouds that bear these sacred figures and the arrangement of the two saints who are having this sort of mystical vision of this episode are very, very close. You can see a better close-up here of this picture. You can see also how indebted Murillo will continue to be to this tradition. This is now a more mature picture by Murillo from probably the 1660s. Here we see Murillo's signature style, the beautiful diaphanous clouds, the incredible softness of how he handles the paint, and yet compositionally, it's quite close still to the models that he had learned in the workshop of Castillo. And we have a comparison of the two paintings here. I think the similarities are quite clear, but the differences in particular of style are what distinguishes them. And here's what Palomino says about this period. He painted at that time the famous cloister of the convent of St. Francis, in which is discoverable that force of clair-obscur, so different from what he afterwards painted. What Palomino means by this term is chiaroscuro in Italian. It's the use of shadow and light, a characteristic of the style of Caravaggio or of the early style of a painter like Zurbaran. And indeed, in these early paintings by Murillo, we would, without knowing better, would be challenged to safely attribute these to Murillo because they so don't align with what we consider to be his signatures, the sweetness, the kind of gentle, almost pastel-like handling of oil paint. This is one of my favorite paintings by Murillo. It's at the Clark in western Massachusetts, and it represents a Franciscan friar having a vision and demonstrating that vision of the death of King Philip II. So here they are on a rocky promontory somewhere in Andalusia, and what we see in the distance is an enormous column of fire which is pushing the soul of King Philip, invisible here in this reproduction, but more or less placed here in the painting, into the heavens. Right? This is the vision that this particular Franciscan is having, and it forms part of a large cycle of paintings that Murillo is commissioned to make for the monastery of San Francisco, no longer extant, in the city of Seville. This is another one of the pictures he paints for that series, one of the two much larger canvases that formed part of it, and known as the Angel's Kitchen, or Friar Francisco and the Angel's Kitchen, which was also a scene of visionary experience. And it is characteristic, I think, to look at this in comparison to a painter like Zurbaran, a better established painter. At this period, Murillo is just starting out. Zurbaran is the giant on the stage of Seville. But we can see how closely someone like Murillo is looking to Zurbaran's aesthetic solutions. So let's look at this central figure of the levitating friar, a wonderful fragment of this painting, which to me is so similar to some of Zurbaran's solutions in this period, including this wonderful painting at the Broad Museum at MSU, or even perhaps more closely, the painting from the Lázaro Galdiano Museum in Madrid of St. Diego de Alcalá. You can see how closely both artists have used this kind of nondescript space of the background to highlight the figure of the saint. Here, however, this is a single figure picture, one of probably a larger series of these saints that are represented from the legs up. And here we have, of course, this is part of a larger picture. The three figures who emerge onto the scene of the friar having the vision and of the angels who are performing tasks in the kitchen remind me in some ways of the figures in Zurbaran's painting of the siege of Cadiz, which we looked at recently. You can see how this kind of grouping of figures is very much related. So, and finally, the still life vignette that we have here is again, to me, similar to some of Zurbaran's still life pictures. And I'm showing you these because so often when we talk about single artists, we forget to place them into conversation with their broader artistic culture. This is something I've tried to do during the course of this series, and I think by always remembering that, of course, Murillo is coming out of a particular artistic context, which at this period is dominated by a figure like Zurbaran, it of course makes sense that the two painters would be in conversation with one another, including as explicitly as these sorts of direct citations. The second large painting in this series is this one, this wonderful and very ambitious scene of the death of St. Clare. And here we have a detail, though again, it's hard to find a good quality image of this painting. But I'd like to compare these two paintings in terms of the very simple but very effective formal solutions they employ that allow them to convey a mystical experience within the tricky format of a long horizontal painting. And so they do this in a very simple way. They clearly mark out the space of everyday life, right? This is these are individuals who are not in any way holy themselves. They're individuals who simply serve as witnesses. But these are individuals from the world of you and me. Then, in the middle, we have the individual who's involved in this scene of mystical rapture. But this is not an individual who is a saint, at least not yet. This is an individual who is in some way in a kind of liminal space between the world of us and the world of the holy. And then we have this scene of the angels. So here we have finally a third stage where we have angelic beings populating this space, although it is a conventual kitchen. And he employs the same solution in the second painting. Here we have the death of St. Clare. She's surrounded by figures from her closest surroundings, including her confessors and a number of other Franciscan nuns. And here, all of a sudden, we have the arrival of holy virgins who will escort her soul to heavens, where she will be greeted by the celestial retinue. So we have very simple solutions for clearly demarcating the levels of space. Earthly, liminal, or a space of passage, and finally, celestial. And it makes sense that he would paint these paintings in such a way because he is, of course, looking to solutions that were employed by Zurbaran just a bit earlier. Indeed, Zurbaran and Murillo, to me, are probably the greatest masters of painting visions in this period. You can see, for instance, how closely Murillo is looking to solutions employed by Zurbaran in a painting such as this one, where we have a vision, here much condensed. We're not dealing with the long horizontal format that Murillo was, but in the same way, the column clearly demarcates this space. This individual simply serves as a witness to the mystical experience that this individual is having here. It's a very simple solution, but a very effective one. Here, the painting is flipped. We have the earthly sphere. Oops. Ah, that's never happened. Let's see. Fingers crossed. Okay, there we are. I think my computer got too bored to listen. Maybe just needed a break. All right, we'll see. Everyone, cross your fingers. So, a simple division of this pictorial space, again, into the earthly sphere, which is the sphere in which this particular individual, not yet a saint, but a living individual who's having a mystical experience, is living. Here we have this sort of liminal space in which the angel protrudes, pushing up with his head this kind of cloud barrier that separates them from the celestial sphere, the sphere of the visionary experience. Visionary paintings are fascinating to me because they represent a particular problem that painters like Zurbaran and Murillo confront in very inventive ways. The problem is this: how do you represent in visual terms something that is invisible? How do you convey pictorially something that is really undescribable? And that's often how visions are described, ironically, that they surpass words, they surpass the capabilities of words. This is one of the great problems, and Spain is one of the most interesting arenas where this is happening, in part because it's the place where we have the great mystics, like Teresa of Avila, like John of the Cross. Spain is one of the great, you could say, training grounds for mystics in this period, but it's also the source of significant anxiety on the part of the church. And there's a simple reason why. A vision is something that's not controllable. The church has no control over an individual's experience of the divine, and you could say even an individual's direct communication with the divine. In situations of vision, the church is pushed aside. The church is not necessary, which is why the church is so eager to police and survey and control any sort of instance of visionary experience. We have dozens and dozens of trials of so-called beatas, who are women who claim to have had visionary experiences, with the Inquisition becoming involved precisely in order to try to prove whether it was a legitimate vision. St. Teresa, after all, is absolutely hounded for a long while, precisely because of this fear that her visions might not be divinely inspired at all, but in fact demonically inspired. And this is a significant concern in this period. So the church is eager to make sure that everything is cleanly squared away, and that the visions are in fact divinely inspired in the way that the individuals who are receiving them believe. Painting a painting of a vision and inserting it into an ecclesiastical context is in some ways a way to control that vision. It's a way to police how that vision will be represented and how it will later be perceived. So it's important for the church to have solutions for the representation of visionary experiences. And you can see how inventive some of Zurbaran's solutions are for precisely representing these sorts of episodes. This is a particularly interesting one from a series of the life of St. Peter Nolasco, who is in this moment contemplating St. Peter, who appears to him to console him that he can't go to Rome to visit the Vatican. And he says, "You have better things to do in Spain than traveling all over Europe. Get to work." And even a wonderful picture like this, recently purchased by the Cleveland Museum of Art, is in some ways a visionary painting. To us, it might seem like a simple genre scene, a woman looking at her child, but of course, there are elements here that reveal it to be a visionary painting, reveal it, in fact, to be a prefiguration of later Christological history. And so we have here this wonderful contemplative Virgin Mary, a young woman who's looking, saddened, at her son, who has pricked his fingers on, surprise, surprise, the crown of thorns, which he's been playing with. And what reveals this to be a vision, what reveals this to be a kind of prophetic moment of looking to the future or realizing that this is a prefiguration of the future, is precisely this diaphanous cloud sphere that's coming into the picture from the left side, with these sorts of angel figures that come in and out of focus as you look at the painting. And Murillo, too, becomes a master of representing visions, of representing these unrepresentable episodes. In a number of scenes, such as this one, the Lactation of St Bernard, where he is quite literally rendered as the milk brother of Christ. This is how that episode is described in the life of St Bernard. And here, the apparition of Christ as a child to St Anthony. You can see St Anthony is here praying, and the Christ child descends to him and physically sits on his book so that St. Anthony is able to embrace him. You'll notice, of course, that clouds are this kind of recurring motive that marks the painting as a particular sort of image, a visionary image. The clouds are often the ways in which spheres are divided pictorially. Here there's this wonderful, strong diagonal that separates the world of earthly concerns, of library books, clothing, and inkwells from the sphere of divine inspiration. And you have this wonderful painting at the Prado, also by Murillo, of St. Augustine having a vision. Here his book falls, and he is looking up at this complex scene of heaven that's opened up ahead of him. And this is actually based on a print after a painting by Van Dyck. So, of course, Murillo, like Zurbaran before him, are all looking at prints in order to inspire their then later enriched pictorial solutions. I'll turn now briefly to discuss Murillo and Italian painting. This is what Palomino says, and I'll preface it by saying that Palomino is a bit critical of the tendency to connect Spanish painters to Italy, and I'll explain in a little bit what I mean by that. Here's what he says. Although some foreign authors have said that he, Murillo, had been in Italy, it is not true. But the case is, foreigners will not allow any Spaniard the least sprig of laurel in this art unless he has paid custom in Italy. That is to say, they won't let any Spaniard just be good for themselves if they haven't gone and studied in Italy, right? If they have not been and made the trek, made the kind of grand tour of great painting in Italy. Not considering, these foreigners, that Italy has transferred itself to Spain in statues, eminent paintings, prints, and books, and that the study of nature, together with the aforesaid auxiliaries, abounds in all countries. Merely, you have great nature all over the place, guys. You don't need to travel to Italy just to become inspired. Not to mention the famous men who have come from thence and have left with us their school and their works from Philip II's time to this present, to which we may add the Spaniards who have traveled into Italy and have returned fraught with instructions from thence. So he's not necessarily critical of Italy's contributions to the development of art. He just wants to protect Murillo's reputation because Murillo never did go to Italy. He's saying he had plenty of exposure to good models. He had plenty of exposure to beautiful Spanish nature, but there was plenty for him to look at locally. He didn't have to make the trek to Italy because Spain had been interested in Italian art for such a long time. There was such a wealth of things for him to admire already here. And he continues, coming to Madrid, he got into favor with Velázquez, by whose means he frequently saw all the best paintings at court and the Escorial and in other royal palaces and noblemen's houses. He copied many pieces of Titian, Rubens, and Van Dyck, whereby he much improved himself in coloring, not neglecting the designing, part from the statues and in the academies of Madrid, and more by the correctness and grand manner of Velázquez, whose communication was of great service to him. And indeed, if we look through the catalogue raisonné of Murillo's paintings, we begin to spot direct citations of Italian paintings, some of which we know were already in Spain at this period, but many which may have been familiar to Murillo through prints and drawings that were also in circulation. So consider this other painting from the series of works he made for the convent of St. Francis, one of this early large series that I already discussed, which is the Blessed Giles before Pope Gregory IX. And it might be a little hard to tell, but he is, in fact, levitating here. You can see how closely this painting resembles a fresco by Raphael, or this widely copied composition also by Raphael of a later pope. But you can see that Murillo cites both of these works in order to create his composition. And of course, it makes sense that he would cite the great papal painter of the Renaissance in order to paint a convincing representation of this scene that, of course, happened in front of the Pope. I hope you forgive me this, but this painting, this fresco, became popular a few years ago because people couldn't help but notice that Sylvester Stallone is a lot older than he says he is. These are two paintings also by Murillo at the Prado from the 1660s, but we can see how closely here he is looking at solutions that are nearly 200 years earlier by Titian. 100 years earlier, sorry. Oops. Why is one of these slides not coming up? Very strange. Well, imagine that there is another slide here, which happens to be this one. So I scaled it down here, but this is the painting that I was hoping would be right here. In fact, on my computer, it still shows up. And let me go back. You can see how closely Murillo is looking to Titian's model of a very contemplative, dramatic close-up of these two holy figures. These are small paintings meant for intimate contemplation and prayer. Again, I thought it might do the trick if I tricked my computer that I was, in fact, not interested in it anymore. But no. But here it is. And you can see, I think, again, how this figure begins to appear as a citation in other works by the painter. So we have a kind of constant process of self-citation, but also of citing other old masters, precisely the sorts of figures that Palomino is noting that are already being collected in Spain, Titian being probably the greatest of those. Now, we have to confront this issue of sweetness. Murillo is often considered the sweetest of the 17th century painters. It's what he's known for. It's what he becomes incredibly popular for from the 18th century onward. It's why the British collect him so vigorously, because they adore that particular quality of his works. So here's what Palomino says. After the work of this cloister, the St. Francis one, either through the force of his fate or the flattery of popular applause, Murillo gave into sweetening the tint more and weakening his shades. No more chiaroscuro, no more Caravagesque drama. We're all about the sweetness now. But yet, with so exceeding a goût, a taste, that in this particular no painter, either Spaniard or other, excelled him. Accordingly, at this very time, out of Spain, a picture of Murillo's is more esteemed than one of Titian's or Van Dyck's. So powerful is the blandishment, the softening of coloring to attract the popular breath and applause of the many. And our own paintings upstairs, I think, are a good example of precisely this blandishment of color, this softening, the turn away from Caravagesque chiaroscuro and the drama that that brought to pictures to a delicate, almost pastel-like handle of paint, a diaphanous flowing of colors into one another. Or perhaps even more clear, not only here in how the paint is handled, but in the general sweetness of the scene. Children playing with lambs. Of course, it's a religious picture that also then prefigures much darker themes in Christological history, but at this particular moment is an image that can be contemplated both for its religious aspect, but also for the simple pleasure of looking at something beautiful. Or this wonderful picture from the National Gallery in London of the boy leaning on a windowsill, one of Murillo's famous pictures of children that are engaged in scenes of street life. This is perhaps one of his absolutely most charming. But not everyone loves sweetness. In fact, if Murillo and his great critical fortune thrived in the 18th and 19th centuries because of sweetness, at the turn of the 20th century, this significantly hurt his critical fortunes. The Birth of the Virgin. This is perhaps as poor a work technically as Murillo ever executed. It should be studied for its bad drawing, false light, black shadows, and weak color. The analysis of error is always an important factor in the establishment of truth, says one particularly vociferous critic of Murillo. It is proper to state, however, that some critics and the public at large do not agree with this dictum and insist upon it that the picture is one of the most charming in existence, he says, dripping with sarcasm. This is the sou Murillo purchased in 1852 for the then enormous sum of 615 francs. It was thought at that time a marvelous creation, but has since fallen in critical esteem. Until today, it holds a very modest place. And rightly so. The sentiment is excessive. The Guido Reni face of the Madonna is insipid. The attitude affected. Look at the hands. The color merely pretty. The drawing rambling, loose, uncertain. The placing of the figure on the canvas and surrounding it with clouds and light is not badly done, but it's too weak for art. It was probably effective at one time for religion. And this is perhaps my favorite. A much better painted picture than Murillo's other Madonnas in the Louvre. The color has a tang to it, and the Madonna does not look as though she were going to die in an ecstasy of sentimentality. It is so good a picture that one may be pardoned for entertaining the queer feeling that perhaps Murillo did not paint it after all. If you're in the mood for some sarcasm from circa 1914, I direct you to John Charles Van Dyck's Paris Critical Notes on the Louvre, a wonderful text that I stumbled upon last week. But this is a reflection of the broader critical fortunes of Murillo in the late 19th and early 20th century, where precisely these qualities were the source of much disgust, were the source of a devaluation of the painter and the re-evaluation of painters like El Greco, like Caravaggio, even like Zurbaran, whose dramatic charge proved to be much more attractive to viewers in that period. In fact, someone well, if you look at the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C., for instance, we have one of the most important collections of modern painting, and we also have an El Greco in that collection. Even in something as simple as bringing works together in a collection of modern painting and adding El Greco to the mix shows that painters like El Greco are valued in this period for their sort of proto-modernist qualities, right? The kind of drama that they bring that is being recognized as a prefiguration of modernity and everything, and standing against everything that a painter like Murillo represented with his simple Victorian sweetness. But it's not, again, fully fair to call Murillo the painter of the sweet. Look at Zurbaran. This is a picture by supposedly the master of chiaroscuro, the master of the dark and dense and solemn picture of the saint. And in fact, would be hard-pressed to call this scene not sweet. We look at this and are charmed by the arrangement of the figures, by the gentle handling of paint, by the soft color palette that is so reminiscent of pictures by Murillo. In fact, it's likely that both Zurbaran and Murillo are looking to other models in this period. So they're becoming inspired by painters like Domenichino, who in the late 17th century is enjoying a great surge of popularity himself. Although he's an earlier painter, his works are much valued. And so it's likely that not necessarily that Zurbaran looked to paintings by Murillo as inspiration, but in fact both may have been inspired by the same sources. Both of their turns away from the Caravaggesque chiaroscuro that I've been discussing may have been the result of looking at pictures such as this one. But if we look at pictures like this, one of perhaps Murillo's most famous scenes of street life in Seville, I think we'd be hard-pressed to call this picture particularly sweet. I'd say it's probing, it's unforgiving in some ways, it's fascinating and quite intense. In some ways, I wonder if pictures like these are better understood in conversation with the kind of genre of the picaresque novel, something like the Lazarillo de Tormes or the Guzman de Alfarache, texts that are satirical but kind of pride themselves in being explorations of the dark underbelly of Spain's cities. Not the court of Philip IV, not the ecclesiastical palace, but the gutter. What's happening to the lowest class and championing those individuals as being worthy of attention. And I think Murillo's work is in very much doing a similar kind of thing. In fact, I think it would be very enriching to read these paintings in conversation with those genres of writing that in this period were very, very popular. This is a painting from the Caridad in Seville, which I'm showing you in order to read one more text from Palomino. This is his representation of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary curing lepers. Again, not a particularly sweet picture. In that of La Caridad, in the said city, there are so many and those so astonishing, speaking of Murillo's paintings, that nobody who either loves or practices the art, but as soon as he sets his foot within the place is so enraptured that 'tis a good while before he can come to himself or recover the use of speech. So Palomino here is praising not those sweet works, not saying that it's the sweetness that has this effect on people, but precisely these large-scale religious works from the Caridad, one of which I just showed you, that have this, this dumbing effect on people. People are so overwhelmed by their power and by their size and by the monumentality of their compositions that it strips their speech away. I turn now to the second to last section, which is about Murillo as an intellectual. Again, the critical fortune of Murillo as the painter of the sweet has made us forget how complex a career in fact he had, and that in fact he was a deeply intellectual painter. For instance, we know that he participated in the legal case that led to the canonization of St. Ferdinand. This is an example that we've discussed now on a number of occasions. And we know that in the 1650s, before St. Ferdinand was officially recognized by the Church, a number of painters were called together in order to testify about what they knew about those saints' images. This is not what I intended. Again, oh, thankfully it showed up in the next slide. This is one of, again, those prints from that publication, which is based actually by after a painting by Murillo that Murillo makes of St. Ferdinand. Here's what he says about paintings of the king of St. Ferdinand that he's seen in the city. For instance, I've chosen one at random, citing from Amanda Wonder's wonderful essay. As concerns the effigy in low relief that is placed on the altar of a chapel in the monastery of San Francisco in the city of Seville, he said and declared, Murillo, this is a legal formula that's very common to speak in the third person, that the effigy of the aforementioned King Ferdinand the Holy in the altar where it is located, without a doubt, is more than 100 years old, and that he knows it by virtue of practice and experience and of information that he has about that painting and its style. The text is a bit dry, I admit, but what's interesting about it is that Murillo here is acting as an art historian. He's saying very interestingly that he knows that the painting is old because he can judge it based on a difference of artistic style between his own period and the period in which that work was painted, and that he has experience because of his own work as a painter in judging artworks. And why is it important to judge this painting to be old? Because if there is a painting that represents St. Ferdinand as a saint over 100 years earlier, that reveals that there is a long-lasting tradition in Seville of venerating St. Ferdinand as holy, even though he has not yet been recognized as such by the Vatican. So Murillo here is participating in a legal debate, revealing himself to be someone with expertise, an expert, an intellectual, in order to judge pictures. So he's becoming a kind of proto-art historian in order to contribute to the particular case. But maybe nowhere is Murillo's self-fashioning as a gentleman and an intellectual more visible than in his wonderful self-portrait. Zurbaran does not, as far as we know, paint any self-portraits, and certainly not as explicitly as here. There is thoughts that maybe he inserted himself into some religious paintings, but here we have a wonderful image of a self-assured, gentlemanly individual proudly looking out from this wonderful fictive frame. So we're challenged here to know, are we looking at a painting of a painting? Well, maybe, but this is the wonderful joke of the image, the trompe-l'oeil, the trick of the eye, where Murillo's hand rests on the frame within the picture. This is a showpiece. This is a showstopper. This is a painting that's meant to thrill, and it's meant to deceive and delight in that deceit. And this, to me, is Murillo's perhaps strongest announcement to the world of his own capabilities as a painter, as an intellectual, as a citizen of Seville. So I'd like to now conclude by looking back at the series, looking back at what we've discussed during the course of these 6 lectures. Seemingly ages ago, on September 29th, in our first lecture, we talked about the long repercussions of 1492, and I wonder, I'm curious if you did indeed encounter the repercussions that I had tried to chart for you throughout the course of the lectures. The fall of the Kingdom of Granada, the expulsion of Spain's Jewish population, Columbus's first voyage, the publication of Nebrija's Grammatica, the standardization of the Spanish language, and the election of the Pope, of a Spanish Pope, and the beginning of what one scholar has called soft colonialism, which can be boiled down to Spain's focus on religion, conquest and territorial expansion, and language. And we spent a number of minutes focusing on this wonderful portrait, and my goal was to convince us to think about the Spanish monarchy as a global entity, a network, more than anything else, of images, of ideas, and of people who were circulating and in a vigorous process of exchange with one another. I mentioned this as well today, we shouldn't look at these painters as monolithic individuals who are not in conversation with anything outside of them. They're, of course, always in conversation with the broader world, which in this period precisely involved all of these paintings traveling, influencing one another. The next week, we focused specifically on the Americas. We asked ourselves, how did the discovery of the Americas transform a European's understanding of the world that they knew, of the known world? And we focused on a number of examples of how Europeans tried to understand that which they were seeing in terms that were familiar to them. This was a particularly evocative example where we have representations of Aztec deities described by names from the Roman pantheon, Jupiter or Hercules. In speaking about Seville in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was really the city that was the protagonist, the city that would be the scene onto which a painter like Zurbaran would arrive and thrive, and as we can see, also the great site of Murillo's artistic triumphs. We looked at it as the great port that was the gateway for a number of products that transformed European life and culture for the entirety of the early modern period and even until today. Silver, luxury goods from the Americas, with relevance to painters, the importation of cochineal or the red dye, and also foodstuffs that transformed in a fundamental way how Europeans lived and what they consumed. And we looked also at the layered histories of that city. The Roman city, the Visigothic city, and the Arabic city, best exemplified probably by the Giralda, the great minaret of the Mosque of Ishbiliya, which was transformed into the bell tower of Seville Cathedral. And we finally started to look at Zurbaran himself in talking about the wonderful ceiling decorations that a figure like Diego López de Arenas would make and was making in that period. We finally saw a series of paintings attributed to a follower of Zurbaran, suggesting that, again, we should not look at paintings in separation from the rest of the context in which they are in. And so, of course, this stylistically Islamic ceiling that we see here in the Church of St. Clare in Carmona is very much part of the context of understanding works such as these attributed to a follower of Zurbaran, how they existed. Finally, we talked about Zurbaran, the Sacred Portrait. This was the closest related to my own research for my book, and we looked at this particular image, seemingly unremarkable, until we noticed this particular inscription which identified this portrait as a saint. And we looked at a number of images that, to me, I think revealed very clearly that the categories of genre or artistic categories that to us seem very comfortable and well-defined, portrait, genre scene, landscape, or even the division between sacred and secular art don't necessarily hold in this period. This was a period in which art could very comfortably inhabit multiple categories, and those categories that to us are inherited knowledge don't apply in this period. I can't resist showing you again this wonderful lady with this notion that the portrait was also something mutable. The portrait was something that could transform and be changed. And the best example of that was this case from central Mexico, where people added wings to the portrait of a bishop, allowing it to inhabit multiple categories, portrait and sacred image simultaneously. Last week, we looked at we turned to the Diablo Cojuelo, the crippled devil, as a guide through the city of Madrid, the great center of the royal court, an aristocratic center, and looked at Zurbaran's brief period there in the 1630s when he contributed to the paintings of the Hall of the Realms, the great political space designed for Philip IV, which included paintings by Zurbaran, including the series of his Hercules paintings, which have been quite criticized for their awkwardness. And we looked at a number of prints slightly later, but that revealed that artists were trying to specifically think about how to deal with spaces that were a bit difficult for paintings to be in particular spaces that were very high up, trying to anticipate optical distortions that those paintings might have been subjected to by purposefully distorting those paintings ahead of time, allowing them then to self-correct when seen from the correct angle. And I'd like to thank Scott for pointing me to an interesting painting at the DMA, actually a gift of Alger Meadows to the DMA, unattributed, but which Scott rightly pointed out, I think, is quite similar to these late 17th century prints. I've always wondered, did anyone ever actually paint based on these prints, or is this simply a larger academic tradition of painting these sorts of recumbent bodies as an academic exercise for young painters to undertake? Interesting image that I'm eager to one day see at the DMA. And finally, we had today's lecture. I'd like to now conclude with an image that I haven't shown, but I think is probably my very favorite painting by Zurbaran, the great painting of St. Serapion at the Wodsworth Athenaeum. This is one of Zurbaran's most iconic scenes of martyrdom. Interestingly, St. Serapion, who was a Mercedarian, was subjected to one of the most horrible tortures. He was dismembered, he was flayed, all sorts of unpleasant things happened to him, but Zurbaran was not interested at all in conveying that particular aspect of the saint's identity. In fact, we'd be hard-pressed to find really any sign of his martyrdom aside from his having been bound here by his hands. I've always been fascinated by how closely Zurbaran looked to other pictorial solutions, and to me it's so clear that here he's citing paintings of the Veronica, that is to say the cloth which was handed to Christ to wipe his face and which left an imprint of Christ's face, which in this period was very much considered to be the origin of all religious imagery, but was also considered to be the justification of using images in religious contexts after Protestant challenges to the use of images in Catholicism. So I think it's no accident that Zurbaran is here referencing this iconic image type of the bound-up cloth that's hanging here from the wall in the way that he's structured his painting of St. Serapion. But what's particularly Zurbaranesque here is this little piece of paper that's pegged, well, really onto what? Is it pegged onto the surface of the painting? Is it pegged onto the wall next to the saint? It's precisely this ambiguity that we're meant to enjoy, that we're left with. And like Murillo's stunning self-portrait, it's precisely this type of visual trick where Zurbaran has both identified the figure, Blessed Serapion, and signed the work. You can just make out here, Francisco de Zurbaran fecit, or made this. it's this type of way that Zurbaran is leaving us his self-portrait in some ways. Here he has inserted himself into a religious painting as a master of illusion, as a master of conveying the deceit of pictures and the delight that we experience in realizing that we've been deceived. In some ways, this is how Zurbaran is revealing himself to be an intellectual, to be a thinker and a theorist of images. Thank you very much.